You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
Hey guys, this is episode 238. On today's show, I'm going to focus on U.S.-Russian relations. I'm going to start this by talking about a Gilbert Doctorow article that appeared on antiwar.com, and I'll link to it in the show notes page. It is a bit of a long read, and it's very detailed. He goes into not only the West media reaction to a Vladimir Putin trip to Austria and Germany, but he also goes through kind of the European reaction to that as well and gives analysis on what all this means and then how Trump's foreign policy has really played into all of this. So I think there's a lot of very important analysis in there. And why it may seem, I guess, a little long, it's very important. And I think it'll kind of help to not only understand this particular situation, but I think gives a lot of context into it just helps you to learn how to read this news altogether. So I highly recommend that article. And like I said, it's linked in the show notes page. Now, as I was saying, the article focuses on Vladimir Putin's trip to Austria and then Germany. In Austria, he attended the wedding of a high-ranking government official. I think it was a minister of some kind. It was the minister's wedding. She's a woman. And I guess at the wedding, which was a pretty private event, and this whole trip was at least out of the Russian government billed as a, kind of private Putin affair. Putin had a dance with the bride. Now, had you read Western, mainstream media, you really would have only gotten the story here that Putin danced with the bride. And I think this kind of fits into, maybe just the Western idea of Vladimir Putin is that, he's kind of just like a very surface level evilish figure. Certainly any kind of commentary you got out of most of the alternative media was the same way, was that, Vladimir Putin, kind of stole a dance with the bride at her own wedding. And, this was him asserting his masculinity over Europe or something like that. I think it's a lot of the underlying context to, some of these, left-wing alternative media reactions. But Gilbert Doctorow kind of breaks down and, points to some, I believe, Belgian media that point out that this girl here apparently is fluent in 8 languages and is a real up-and-comer in, I think, Austria, but also European politics in general. Having speaking 8 language, I'm sure that's very valuable. And so you can see how, in Europe, that, you can find media sources that go into more than just a surface level kind of analysis of these international events that I'm sure have a lot of importance. Now, Gilbert Doctorow also points out that right now Austria is heading an important European Financial Council and will be for the next 6 months. So this is another reason that's, kind of important to stay in good with Austria. And then after this wedding, an event I believe that really wasn't covered at all by the Western media, I guess Putin took a car ride with the Austrian head of state and, they had a conversation. Now, unlike a typical U.S. diplomatic venture, there wasn't a massive, press conference. Trump says something before he enters the plane every time. They, meet and shake hands in front of the flags, it's all alternating flags and all that kind of stuff. That didn't happen here. So, Putin has the conversation, no big press conferences or anything like that. And then he travels on to Germany to meet with Merkel. Again, this is, a very low key event. There's no big photo ops or press conferences. Putin speaks with Merkel, I believe, for 3 hours. The governments did release agendas, but so far I haven't, and Gilbert Doctorow points out in the article, we haven't had any clue as to, if there were any agreements made during the meeting or really what was discussed, what was the nature of the meeting. Now, it seems like the big issues here that were at stake, probably in both meetings, but, especially the Merkel meeting, would be, what happens as U.S. sanctions are put on Russia and Iran? Is Germany going to try to run afoul of those sanctions and then have secondary sanctions put on by the U.S.? This is most important, I think, in the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is a pipeline that Russia is looking to build into Europe. I think it connects down either directly through Germany or through Poland. And either way, this could bring a lot of energy and reduce energy prices in Europe. However, the U.S. sanctions at least make it more difficult to get this pipeline built, because there are some U.S. sanctions against Russia that are specific, I believe, to energy construction. And then the other big issue, of course, is Ukraine and the fact that Russia has now annexed the Crimean Peninsula. A lot of analysis on this in past episodes, so I'm not going to get into here. But there's still a civil war in Ukraine. There's still at least monthly violations of that ceasefire. And from time to time, it flares up that it seems like it ends up being weekly or daily violations of the ceasefire. But there's not, it hasn't been a major outbreak of fighting between Kiev and the rebels in the Donbass region of Ukraine recently. However, that doesn't mean that there's still not a lot of tensions there. The United States under Trump, and as something I'll talk about a little bit later in the episode, a lot at the direction of John McCain, ended up providing lethal aid to the Ukrainian government in Kiev that has a significant neo-Nazi contingency within the military and political factions of that government now. And if you want more on that, I'm going to link to an episode of, I don't know the name of the show. It's Mads Blumenthal, and I think it's a part of his Gray Zone project, and he put together, this little documentary interview thing where he goes and profiles the Ukrainian head of parliament there, who has a lot of ties to neo-Nazi groups, and I believe even founded one. And then there's also the Syria issue. Russia is looking to return refugees into Syria, and to do that, it's going to require a lot of money to rebuild, provide the money to have construction for all of these people. There's going to be a lot of security, and it's just going to be a very expensive process overall. As expensive as the war efforts are, rebuilding afterwards is also a very expensive process. There always ends up being a lot of corruption. It causes a lot of problems. However, if entire villages were destroyed, and, those people would like to return to Syria, where do they go? Where do they have money? If all their possessions were destroyed, they probably have none. Jobs are lacking because all the infrastructure has been destroyed. So, it is going to take some international aid, I would suppose, to get that whole process kick-started. Hopefully, they're able to work in a way that it minimizes the amount of corruption that comes out of this. I know that sounds like a pretty wishful thinking, but, an interesting article that I read by Reese Ehrlich, who wrote the great book Inside Syria, that I've actually read the first chapter of, and I need to keep reading, but then I got distracted with Dirty Wars, which is Jeremy Scahill's book, which is what I'm reading now. But anyways, in that article by Reese Ehrlich, he goes into a little bit of how, it's been the post-fall of Saddam political corruption in Iraq, and, the financial corruption that has come along with all the US aid that has come into the country, and all the new power available to people, that has, caused a lot of people in Iraq to suffer, to not have clean water, to not have electricity. And so, to look to ways to find to minimize that, I guess, would be helpful. But those are some issues on the agenda. I'm sure that Germany would at least like to stem the flow of immigrants and refugees from Syria into Europe at this point. There's a major battle coming up in Syria here, which is going to be for the Idlib province, which is the main holdout of the Al-Qaeda-linked Syrian rebels at this point. And it's a massive area of Syria, and will probably be one of, if not the largest military operation that the Syrian army undergoes through this process. And it's going to be very tricky in dealing with the kind of situation in Turkey. Of course, Germany and Turkey are pretty hostile diplomatically right now. So, there's a lot to be discussed between Trump and Merkel here. And so towards the end of the article, getting back to the Doctorow article, he says that, really all the actions of the United States under Trump, with the sanctions against Iran and the sanctions against Russia, has pushed Germany and more of the, Eastern Central European countries, I think, into the Russia orbit. Just a little bit. Not to say that Germany is now like a puppet state of Russia, or that Germany is not a U.S. ally anymore, because I think sometimes, especially in the U.S. mainstream media, they really oversimplify this to make it seem like, oh, well, we just lost Germany as an ally. No, Germany is still much closer to the United States. They're still a member of NATO. The Mutual Defense Treaty is there. However, there are more complications in the U.S. and German relationship as Trump continues to apply sanctions against countries, and those sanctions have effects of hurting the German economy, especially those sanctions against Russia and Iran. And Doctorow says that he thinks that this is actually intended consequences of Trump's foreign policy, and that Trump realizes that he can't do anything to get America out of all of its entanglements he can't just go and say, we're going out of NATO, because then the Congress will go crazy and start passing resolutions and laws saying that Trump can't leave NATO and all this other stuff. And so by, putting demands on NATO that they meet their 2% commitment and float the idea that it's going to be a 4% commitment to defense spending of GDP, by putting these sanctions on that, maybe what Trump is doing is just trying to break up those alliances the best he can by sabotaging the relationships. Now, I think this is a much more ineffective way to do it, and probably much worse for the United States economy. And that would be much better if Trump, just kind of says, I want to get out of NATO. However, if he did it that way, then the European countries and Merkel and all them would freak out too and probably have a fit about the United States wanting to leave NATO, even though, they constantly kind of position themselves against Donald Trump. So I don't know how intentional this is by Trump and how much I agree with Doctorow on that point. But I just thought it was a really interesting article and a really important read, and I suggest all of you go through it. To get a little bit more into U.S.-Russian relations, I read a report that a U.S. official said the United States rejected a proposal, and it didn't say by who. I would imagine it was a Russian proposal, but maybe it was Iranian too, for Iran to pull back from Syria. To pull back from Syria, and in exchange, the United States wouldn't reimpose the JCPOA sanctions against Iran. This seems like something that should have been a pretty decent deal for Donald Trump. If the United States stays within the JCPOA, then it eliminates Iran's potential to have a secret nuclear weapons program. If they pull out of Syria, then that's the biggest battlefield, I think, really, that Iran is fighting in the Middle East. And, the United States then doesn't have to put on sanctions against Iran that are not only going to hurt some American companies like Boeing and the airplane makers, but are also going to hurt the economies of our allies. And at the same time, they get the concession of Iran pulling back from Syria. Now, all the Iran hawks are going to complain about all the other things Iran is doing with their ballistic missile program, with their involvement in the Yemen civil war, and their involvement with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and their support for Hamas. But, at some point, you have to realize that this was a good deal, that they were getting an additional concession from Iran for staying in a deal that they were already complying to, just to get the United States to come back in it after they had left it. And so it didn't even mean that the United States would really have to re-enter the JCPOA or anything like that, just not put those sanctions back on. So this seems like a foolish move to me, and a deal the Trump administration probably should have taken, but of course, I guess we can't be surprised. In some good news, the U.S. and Russia are going to reopen some military communication channels. It's always good when these channels are open, just because it cuts down on the risk of, kind of a potential mistake leading to a bigger conflict between the United States and Russia. These have been especially useful in Syria, where the United States and Russia can inform each other where they're bombing that day, that way as to not run afoul of each other's either missile systems or opposing planes. The United States has announced that they're reactivating the second naval fleet. This is the Atlantic Naval Fleet, and it's going to be based out of Norfolk, Virginia. The article on antiwar.com by Jason Diss outlines that it was concern over Russian submarine activity in the Atlantic that's causing the United States to reactivate this fleet. Of course, it's, I think, just going to be probably a boondoggle, if anything. The shipbuilders will get a little bit richer off it. We'll all get poorer. And the Russian threat could be best minimized by trying to normalize diplomatic relations with the country, which it seems more and more the United States government, minus Donald Trump, is doing everything they can to actually make these relations worse. We have National Security Advisor John Bolton saying that sanctions are going to remain against Russia until Russia changes its behavior. I've talked in the past about how talking this way seems childish and, kind of disrespectful. And I'm sure it's probably taken that way by other countries, and I'm sure John Bolton understands that as well. But, if we look at the situation in Syria and see that, I think at the end of the day, as it becomes more and more obvious that the Assad government is going to survive this civil war, that, Russia is now a power in the world again, and is not a, blanket U.S. hegemony over the entire world, and that they were able to intervene in the U.S., quote unquote covert actions in Syria and prevent the fall of Bashar al-Assad. And so it's probably, now inappropriate for the United States and John Bolton to talk to Russia like, they're a powerless force in the world. They're not a child. They definitely have, the ability to affect geopolitics as well, especially when the U.S. is messing around in Russia's backyard. Now, the unfortunate thing here is that, if you look at the behavior that the U.S. demands Russia change, it's backing Assad, it's the annexation of Crimea, it's the interfering in elections, and it's the chemical weapons attack in Salisbury, UK. Now, the last two things are just unproven allegations. And so, Russia has to prove that they are not guilty of an unproven allegation, which is really difficult to do, and I think impossible in most cases. And it looks like at least the Salisbury poisoning, the Russian government definitely isn't guilty. They're definitely not guilty of, I think, actually being the ones that changed the results of the U.S. election or anything like that in 2016. Now, Russia, like the United States and most other countries, may, try to run some media in opposing countries' elections and sway influence and all this other kind of stuff. But, everybody does that, and that can't be a crime that the United States puts heavy sanctions on Russia for and refuses to lift those sanctions until they stop doing that. And as far as the Crimea thing, that's pretty much resolved now. And Syria as well. It seems that Iran is going to win the war, just like the Crimean Peninsula now belongs to Russia. And just like, I pointed out that these sanctions hurt the European economies, there is results to the U.S. diplomatic actions against Russia. U.S. officials pointed out that during March, there was a time when the U.S. had expelled 50 Russian diplomats from the United States, and Russia responded by expelling, I believe, 50 American diplomats in, kind of a tit-for-tat move. Now, it would seem that, okay, well, this happened, but it really doesn't matter because there must not be much talking between the United States and Russia. However, I think it's been more or less an open secret for a while that, they use these diplomatic posts in order to put spies in the opposing countries. And some guy working for the United States Embassy isn't actually doing what they claim to do. He's a spy in the country, some kind of covert agent. And they said that because of that move in March, the United States lost some spying capabilities in Russia. And so this does have real impacts on the United States ability here. We have a story about a Swiss bank freezing about $5 billion in Russian assets due to U.S. sanctions. And then I read here that Russia is looking at stepping up its delivery of the S-400 missile system to Turkey in 2019. This is going to be a big deal when it happens because the United States has demanded that Turkey not purchase this missile system, saying that I guess it would give Russia too much intelligence about our F-35 and wouldn't allow Turkey to plug into the NATO air defense system. Story out of the United States I just wanted to bring up, and that is Reality Winner, the leaker of a election document, was sentenced to 5 years in prison after she pled guilty. It's just disappointing to me, I guess, that the leakers always end up with more time than typically the crimes they're exposing. Now, I don't think Reality Winner here was really exposing a crime, and I don't think her leak was, like a big deal like Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning, but there is a real campaign against people who leak things without, their boss telling them to at the government. So, if you're a U.S. official and you're leaking information the story I talked about last, the diplomatic expulsions by the United States and Russia affecting U.S. spying capabilities. Well, that's an official leak and that's okay. But if you leak something you're not supposed to, they really come at you with the hammer. In probably the worst news I have for you today, Donald Trump cancels Mike Pompeo's upcoming trip to North Korea. It did seem that, I guess, the denuclearization effort didn't have any like kind of positive signs in the last couple weeks. There was the big get together of North and South Korean families. And so, mothers see their sons for the first time in 60 or 70 years now. And it's a very emotional, nice moment. They only get to spend like 12 hours together, but at least that's, some time and a nice thing to have happen. But it, is much more of a Korean story than a U.S. involved story where you would, look for either the United States to start making concessions and start giving security guarantees, or for North Korea to continue to dismantle its either nuclear weapons program or missile program, or start to hand over some of those missiles or weapons. So maybe that was going to happen when Mike Pompeo went to North Korea. And even during the past couple of months, Donald Trump says it's okay if we take this process slow. But Trump comes out and says that, well, it doesn't look like North Korea is trying really hard. He blames China in some part for this, saying that China isn't doing enough to put pressure on North Korea. And so now Mike Pompeo will not be traveling to Pyongyang to talk about the North Korean weapons program. Maybe we'll get some more details in the upcoming days, specifically what the Trump administration is looking for out of North Korea, whether they're asking for too much right now, or it's an issue of North Korea really dragging their feet and not wanting to denuclearize, and this all being some kind of diplomatic game. The unfortunate thing, I think, is that the U.S. media is very quick to just say, well, Trump tried and failed. The Singapore summit was a waste. All it did is legitimize Kim Jong-un. And, now we're back to having a bigger problem than we had before. I really don't think that's the case, and that, this process could continue to move along. But hopefully U.S. politics aren't what's getting in the way of that. The Russian government is going to be hosting some talks on the Afghan war. They invited the United States, the Taliban, and the Afghan government. Only the Taliban are going to be attending those talks. Some statements out by the different leaders of some jihadist groups I wanted to mention. The first one, I believe, came from Jolani, and he is the head of Al-Qaeda in Syria, and he called on his forces to continue to fight the Assad government. And like I previously said, we're looking at the upcoming of the start of the campaign by Assad to take back the Idlib province, where most of the Syrian jihadist Al-Qaeda type rebels remain. We have a statement out from Baghdadi, who is the leader of ISIS. He called on his, troops to keep fighting. Like I said, there was that UN report that said, I believe there's like 10 to 15,000 ISIS fighters in Iraq and Syria, 10 to 15,000 in each. And so, it's very interesting to see what happens there. That report also said that Baghdadi was on his way possibly to Afghanistan. But that's his statement. And then, Zarqawi, who's the head of Al-Qaeda, he called on all Muslims to kind of fight together. And so, not that those statements are all individually important or anything, but the fact that they're all putting them out all indicates that these three guys are alive. There's pretty frequent reports out that, these people were either assassinated or killed or something like that. But it seems like these three are still alive as the Syrian civil war rages on. To finish up with Syria, there's a pretty good report in Moon of Alabama by Bernard, just kind of giving a sit rep on that war there, and how the Assad government is looking to start a campaign to take back the Idlib province. I think one of the big factors in this military operation is going to be if the rebels can either put together some propaganda claiming that a chemical weapons attack occurred, or actually carry out a false flag chemical weapons attack. If we look at, some examples of past chemical weapons attack, 2013 in Ghouta, it was a false flag where the rebels sent off the sarin gas, killing upwards of 1,000 people. That almost led to Obama entering the Syrian civil war at that time. Then in 2016, we had the alleged chemical weapons attack in Khan Sheikhoun. And it seemed what happened is that the rebels set off an explosive in the street and took advantage of a Syrian government airstrike on a Al-Qaeda headquarters that started a fire and sent off, burning some chemicals and other weapons, that created a gas, that did end up killing some people. However, this is far different from using like a chemical weapon on your own people or an attack like Duma, where basically somebody, there was a lot of dust, through the bombing. Somebody yelled gas, and they started treating it like a gas attack, even though there's no evidence that anybody carried out a gas attack. However, the most recent situation ended up with the United States carrying out airstrikes against the Assad positions. And so, we could see the United States look to escalate the war again against Assad if the rebels could produce this kind of propaganda, or for whatever crazy reason Assad decides to carry out a chemical weapons attack. I mean, I guess it's not impossible. However, if we look at the evidence of the alleged chemical weapons attack throughout the Syrian civil war, none of them have been proven, and most of them have been proven either to be false flags or propaganda type events. Now, in that Moon of Alabama article, Bernard talks about this and the fact that John Bolton came out and said that if there is a chemical weapons attack, the United States would look to take action against Assad. And so it certainly seems that the United States and our Western allies are really asking for the rebels to put together this kind of propaganda so we continue to drag out that war. And the last thing I want to point out from the article that I thought was pretty interesting is that about 70% of the Idlib province is controlled by Harir al-Tasham, or that Al-Qaeda affiliate there. All right, the last thing I want to mention on today's show, just to round out, and I wasn't actually going to comment on this, but John McCain passed. It had been long expected as he had some kind of terminal brain cancer that was diagnosed over a year ago. They announced that he wasn't going to receive treatment anymore, and then they announced his passing. I don't want to come out and like bash a dead guy on the day that he dies because he died. However, there is a lot of glorification of John McCain going on right now. People calling him the greatest American patriot, a real American hero, and all this other kind of stuff. When if we look at John McCain's record from the Senate, for the past 15 or 20 years, everything his vote, almost every single one, has been really destructive to America. And it's only because he was insulted by Donald Trump that anybody, I think, really feels like John McCain is a hero at this point. I mean, if we look at just some things to go over really quick, he voted for both the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And even though later on he said that we knew the war in Iraq was going to be difficult, and later said that we probably shouldn't have done the war in Iraq, he was somebody that prior to the war was telling the American people that, hey, this war is going to be easy, we're going to roll in, we're going to get them fast, and then we're going to be out. And, this was a guy who was a POW. He was a tortured prisoner of war. And so his voice carried a lot of weight, and those lies that he told the American people were very important. He has been an undying hawk against Iran, and at times being exuberant about it and joking. He did his little bomb Iran song, and everybody will point to all the statements he made, that we don't want to go to war with Iran, that a war with Iran would be terrible. He also has these joking statements, and I think most of his supporters would support war with Iran because of the position that John McCain takes. He really supported the Syrian opposition to Assad at the start of the war, even being photographs with the Northern Storm Brigade, and those are the ones that sold American journalists. I don't think it was Foley, I think it was the other guy, over to ISIS, and they ended up cutting off his head or killing him in some terrible way. And even though, this should have been a humiliation for John McCain, he should have said, oh boy, I really can't tell friend from foe in Syria, so we gotta, kind of stop that operation there. Was an undying, I guess now die, but he was a longtime supporter of the Assad must go policy and wanted to arm the rebels up until the very end, and that's very disappointing. He is a big supporter of the Kiev government in Ukraine, and this is, part of his overall anti-Russia position. This leads him to speaking in front of Ukrainian militants, some of those being part of neo-Nazi linked groups, and telling them that, I believe it was 2016, he went over there on New Year's and told them that that was going to be a war of offense. He has lobbied heavily to get those Ukrainian forces, first regular aid from the United States, then military aid from the United States. He's a big supporter of NATO expansion that increases hostilities with Russia. He even called Rand Paul a puppet of Vladimir Putin on the Senate floor because of Rand Paul's opposition to Montenegro joining NATO. And so John McCain isn't a hero. He is somebody who has supported bad policy time and time again because he had the hubris to think that he knew what was best for all the people across the Middle East and Eastern Europe, and has, advocated for policies that has made the people of the United States poor, has led to dead Americans, has killed tens and hundreds of thousands and, a million people across the Middle East. And is John McCain guilty for every single one of those deaths? Well, he's not, but he also played an important role in getting the policies passed that killed all those people. And so that is something that, his legacy needs to, that needs to be reminded as part of his legacy. And like I said, I didn't really plan on talking about this, but man, just people glorifying him and his legacy, and when all these terrible things are part of his legacy, I don't think it could be left unsaid. Maybe in the future, after I feel a little bit less terrible about bashing a dead guy, I'll have somebody on the show to talk about, in detail, all of John McCain's, crimes or support for terrible policies that led to unnecessary war and so many unnecessary deaths. All right, that's where we'll wrap up the show. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. Libertarianinstitute.org is the best place to find all my work. My daily news roundup is there. My podcast is there on the homepage. If you want to support this show, Foreign Policy Focus is on Patreon. So patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. If you donate to the show there, just $5 a month gets you some bonus content. I have something to put up. After I recorded Foreign Policy Focus 237 with Will and Pat, we stayed on a little bit extra and talked about some other stuff, including like internet censorship and social media. So I think it's good stuff and you might enjoy it. And then on Twitter at KYAAALE, and check out the Libertarian Union on Facebook, some of the greatest libertarian podcasts out there.